A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome once again to films I'm willing to talk about again. So now that we're on the brink of eventually having the sequel to Joker, known as Joker Folie à Deux, it's a pretty good time for me to, in fact, touch up on the remainder of the Stuart Little film series. It started off with the big success of Columbia's 1999 film, followed by a sequel in 2002. Less than 3 years after the first one came out. By that time, I was just over 3 years old. And it was not long before I would have a brother of my own. Coincidentally, much like what the first film gave us. The story of how a boy got a brother of his own, and while they had some difficulty at first, they warmed up to each other with a bit of time and patience. In terms of the sequel though, this goes above and beyond the likes of just a simple adventure of a brother encountering another brother of his, and moreover, how the family adjusts to the new circumstances. They're more than willing to incorporate Stuart's lifestyle into their own, along with the many, many prospects of Stuart that he has to offer. But of course, the film centers us on a nice little token of live-action glory in the year 2002. That same year, we had gotten a bunch of other films. Eight Crazy Nights, Treasure Planet, John Q, Spider-Man. Yeah. It was a pretty busy year for films. But there was also a lot of music. There was also some video games. And of course, lots of other things as well. In the case of Stuart Little, however, Stuart Little 2 opens up with a unique musical tone. In fact, this soundtrack compared to the first one has brought up even more memories over the years. There's plenty of songs that I could recall, but we'll get to those in greater detail later on. In any case though, a nice big morning comes around where George, Little, plus their parents, and even the introduction of another child of theirs. Yep, that's right. George and Stuart now have a sister to deal with. And while she hasn't been talked about many times over, it's safe to assume that this had to have happened sometime between the two films. In any case though, it's just a big morning in the state of New York. The city itself was nice and bright, with skylines having a nice big sunlight. And we get plenty of aerial views, not just of New York itself, but with a multitude of other things. But as that view in the little house takes place, with all the things that eventually come to action, when everybody's up and running to get their regimen done, to get their routine put together, George and Little head off to school, and of course, Martha gets her daughter to speak. All the while also trying to feed her, which unfortunately leads to the food being dropped on the floor. Snowbell basically comes over and eats it, thinking that it's some fancy feast, like fish. But much to his dismay, it's just that leftover baby food. Yeah. And as for Hugh Laurie's character, Frederick Little, he himself goes out to his job. It's not entirely talked about on what he does for a living, but we do in fact get to see plenty of action from everybody else. We do have a school day with the likes of George and Little coming to an end eventually, with the teacher talking about Canada and the differentiation between it and the United States. She tells them about their next assignment, all the while Stuart and George prepare to leave class. Stuart does try to spend some time with his classmates, but they apparently have other plans, like guitar lessons and whatnot. So he unfortunately is forced to go out alone. And well, it comes to terms that there apparently comes a bird from the sky, lands in his car, and she unfortunately falls unconscious. However, when she does come to, she tells him that they're not alone. Someone else is chasing after her. And how she fell into his car in the first place was because of a big, bad falcon. Yeah, As it's later implied in the film, once they get out of there alive, with their car barely making it past a truck, and of course finding haven inside a pipe, once they get back home, and Frederick himself comes to realize that the bird named Margalo was saved by Stuart earlier on, she explains to him that there was apparently a falcon in the area chasing after her, hunting her down, for a certain reason. They are fierce creatures after all. And Stuart was very lucky to be alive, and to have saved somebody in the process, from one of those exact birds in the city. But of course, even though another house guest in the little house, it's a little too much for Snowbell to handle even, which is kind of surprising. But everybody else seemed to have warmed up to her in the same regard as how Stuart was brought into the home with open arms. But nevertheless, there eventually comes a time when Margalo actually encounters that very same falcon who was after her. Apparently, this falcon, who was played by James Woods, wanted to do some certain things to Margalo, including getting some jewelry. In fact, there was a little thing that Margalo was carrying that was supposedly a part of what was left of her family before the falcon came by and took her away. However, she basically was just blackmailed to work for him, stealing all kinds of stuff. And when the time eventually passes through, George and Stuart and Margalo, they basically do form their own unique relationship as friends, and somehow even beyond that level. But we never quite get to have that sort of relationship truly expanded upon, because after all, the main thing about Margalo is that she wanted the falcon rid of. Yeah. Even though she tried her best to acclimate to his many needs and desires, that falcon was just too good to possibly be true. He has that cold-hearted, patient vibe, which, like most villains whom are rather intelligent, cunning, and eager to get their plans up and running, no matter what the cost may be. This in particular, it basically rivals that of other well-known villains that were played by certain actors of that time. You remember Tony Jay from Hunchback of Notre Dame? This was one mere example of how, by the late 90s and early 2000s, there were a multitude of different villains being played by some well-known actors of our generation, and James Woods still does play up a nice villainous role. Eventually, it got so well that he was brought into Family Guy multiple times. I mean, he basically annoyed Peter, then stole his identity, and eventually tried to create a crappy sitcom called Class Holes, alongside Brian Griffin. I guess you could say that James Woods is one of those actors whom, while he did a great job back in the day, nobody could truly warm up to him or adjust to his new circumstances nowadays. Kind of like what happened with actors like Alec Baldwin and even Jeffrey Jones. Oh man, I'm glad I didn't mention him in the last film. Oh boy. That would have been pretty messed up. Anywho though, when word eventually gets out that Margalo had left the house after a series of other things came around, including a montage, well, Stuart eventually comes up with a plan to go after Margalo. And George finds out about this, tries to go with him, but Stuart instead opts to have George cover for him. Yeah. Lie about Stuart's doing in the morning. Because when they go to breakfast, Stuart obviously won't be there. George gets the idea that Stuart is attending a school play, and he basically tells his parents about that. They believe him about it, because he never taught a lie about it before. But as we know nowadays, lying is pretty easy to detect. And anyone who does tell them, even if it's your first offense, boy, it's a lot of trouble you could be building up. Your relationship with your parents could likely be damaged in a pretty horrific way. Well, you know what? I feel like one other moment might as well be implied. Stuart Little used to fly a plane. Yeah, it's one thing where he had cars and boats, and also playing a damsel in distress on the train tracks. Of a model railway, that is, not a real one. But in any case, he also went ahead to fly a model plane around the house. He accidentally started it up, couldn't get it to stop, flew through Central Park, and crashed it, and the plane had to be thrown out because Martha was just fed up with that thing. It's much too dangerous, according to her, so yeah. However, the plane does become an important factor later on in the film, because after all, like I said, Stuart proceeds to leave the house to search for Margalo, and Snowbell accompanies him. They eventually go out with his car, and while Stuart drives for the most part through the streets and alleyways looking for Margalo, they eventually stop and park, with Stuart going on foot alongside Snowbell to meet up with Monty, whom does have a pretty good sighting of the city itself, and some good knowledge about what buildings are occupied by certain people, including the Falcon himself. Yeah, and this is all coming from a cat who was trying to get food out of a certain Chinese restaurant. And he was thrown out into the trash can, which I thought was pretty funny back in the day. Anyways, Monty does explain to them that the Falcon does organize his little plans from the very tip-top of an old Pishkin building. Yep, the building is old. It's never really visited by people. So this, of course, provides a good lair for the likes of the Falcon himself. And Margalo obviously wouldn't be too far behind, should that be the case. So, the following morning, George does get a phone call from Stuart, believe it or not. Stuart goes up to a phone booth, because after all, those kind of phones you had to pay quarters for. 25 cents per 3 minutes. Yeah. Nowadays, you can have whatever phone calls you want, short or long, for free, depending on what you got. But above all that, Stuart does tell George about where they're at the old Pishkin building, just in time too, because the phone eventually cuts off. And George unfortunately has to hang up quickly, since it seemed Martha was going to catch on to Stuart's little thing, having George take the fall for him like a true brother would. And when George's friend comes over to visit, well, George apparently claims they need a calculator based on the play. And eventually the two head back over to their house. Yeah. It becomes evident that between George and his friend, the lie was eventually going to catch on. George's parents would eventually find out the truth, and it would be pretty bad for George especially. Probably even worse for Stuart, since obviously he was risking his life just to find Margalo, and who knows how she could have gotten anywhere in the city with a Falcon on her tail. In any case though, when Stuart does make it up to the Pishkin building, and eventually does find Margalo, he's not out of the blue just yet, because the Falcon arrives on scene. And it gets heated pretty quickly. The Falcon proceeds to grab Stuart by his backpack with his talons. And Stuart basically shoots an arrow at him. It doesn't even do anything worse than causing him to flinch slightly. And that's how you know he really messed up. He didn't calculate his plan correctly, and more importantly, the Falcon seemed a lot stronger than he realized. And now, all it took was for the Falcon to hang Stuart well over 1,000 feet above the ground. Many, many stories high, and Stuart gets dropped. He falls supposedly to his death, with Margalo herself getting captured, placed into an old bucket, where she unfortunately is helpless. She just can't believe that her friend had gotten killed because of her stupidity. She basically just left him behind, unexpectedly. And just because she actually saved Stuart one other time, because after all, there was a certain instance where a wedding ring had gone missing. And it turns out Margalo was responsible for this. Let's not forget that the fact that Margalo was actually meant to be a jewelry thief for the Falcon. And that wedding ring belonged to Martha Little, was stolen from the house, and they thought it went down the drain of all things. Yeah, there was a little adventure on that whole thing that did not go so well. Especially not for Stuart. I mean, he was terrified of that thing. Oh, but it's even worse when you know the fact that while Stuart somehow survives the fall by landing in a trash truck that's on its way to the harbor to be unloaded onto a barge, well, things eventually do not improve. Not only is Margalo trapped in that bucket, but Snowbell eventually catches up, hoping to find Stuart and Margalo, because he did have to take a bit of a detour, thanks to a window washer. But even when he does make it up there, it's a sad, pitiful moment, where Snowbell unfortunately learns the horrible news that Stuart was murdered by the Falcon. And that's when you know. He actually does show how much he actually cared for Stuart this whole time, by shedding a few tears, and he just couldn't even hide it. It really goes to show that Snowbell, while he was a bit cruel to Stuart back then, especially when they first met, it did not go so well for them. But Snowbell just came to learn the lesson that no matter what it is, even if it's a tasty snack to him, he just had to accept the fact that Stuart was family, and he should not eat family members. But then, of course, Stuart manages to wake up aboard the trash barge out in the middle of nowhere. Yeah. It was out to sea, supposedly on its way to a dump. And as for George, well, Martha arrives on the doorstep of his friend's place, especially after a little conversation they had on the phone earlier, discussing about Stuart's whereabouts, especially because they were supposedly together at the time. But when Martha realized it, George had lied to her about Stuart, and as a result, he is brought back to the little house where Frederick, Martha, and Stuart all sit down at the table. And boy, was it horrible. George is not only in trouble, he's in big trouble, as Frederick himself implies. They all proceed to take a little trip out by taxi in the hopes to find Stuart before he ends up in a lot of trouble. And while it's unfortunate at first, his car is eventually found to have been heavily vandalized. Yeah. Who vandalized it? Who really knows? Eventually, though, Stuart does manage to find out this little thing known as the silver lining. Because after all, if you remember that plane I mentioned earlier, well, it turns out that it was aboard the same barge, almost fully intact. It just needed a few parts in order to make it functional again. And that's exactly what Stuart plans to do. He not only reassembles the plane, but he actually gets it to work again, under his full power. He manages to take off from the barge, head back to the city in the hopes to save Margalo, proceeding to head straight back to the Pishkin building, right from where he started. And as the Littles, aboard that same taxi, continue to head down the streets, it eventually becomes clear that Stuart is in fact at the Pishkin building, as George was forced to relay that info to his parents. But it certainly doesn't get any better from there. No. Margalo was able to escape from the bucket, with Snowbell's help, and proceeds to, in fact, run away, with the ring in hand, causing the Falcon to show up. And boy, did they get in a bit of arguments, to the point where Margalo just straight up flees from her captor. With the ring in tow, she thinks that she could be able to get back to the Littles with the ring safely in their possession again. All the while, Falcon is closing in fast. But thankfully, Stuart shows up just in time to save her. Yeah, some more exchanges between the two are filed in this epic chase scene. It not only carries through the city streets, but also in the sight of the Littles themselves, who eventually work the chase after the likes of both the Falcon and the plane, which has Stuart and Margalo inside. Then, of course, they all fly through Central Park and eventually turn up in the center, where they're near the large fountain. When the likes of Stuart and Margalo find out that they cannot outpace the Falcon, the right wing, the top segment of the biplane itself is torn off. Stuart barely manages to get it out of there before it crashes. Falcon goes in for one final strike, proceeds to have Margalo tossed out of the plane as Stuart prepares to make one last edge to have the Falcon defeated once and for all. And how he manages to do this is even more clever. He takes out that same ring that Margalo had stolen, and using the light of the sun, is able to cast an impressive bright flash against the Falcon's eyes, causing him to be temporarily blinded. Stuart then proceeds to escape from the plane while it's flying at full speed towards the Falcon. They collide with each other. The plane is now completely destroyed. But unfortunately, Stuart does not end up in a good spot. His makeshift parachute, which was made by a handkerchief, gets sliced in half, and he ends up falling once again, potentially to his doom, but then Margalo comes in, grabs him by the ring that he's holding on to, and they all make it back down to safety. Meanwhile, Monty is at it again trying to find some food. Luckily, the Falcon arrives just in time to become Monty's next meal. Yeah. Talk about an epic defeat right there. Get blinded by a ring, hit by a plane, and then eaten by a cat. So, easily a much better climactic finish than in the first film, where a cat just gets slapped in the face by a branch and then tossed into the water, and then chased by dogs, as audibly known at the end of Stuart Little Part 1. When all is said and done, Stuart, Margalo proceed to make one last goodbye as dusk settles in at the little house. They're all on top of the roof, and Margalo proceeds to fly away with, believe it or not, the young baby. The sister of the Littles proceeds to say her first words, "Bye bye birdie." Frederick, of course, is shocked, and everybody else feels about the same way. They all make their way back down to the inside of the house. And right then and there, the camera pans to the right as we are greeted with the song "I'm Alive" by Celine Dion. And it's a nice set of credits that truly brings back a lot of memories, even to this day. And believe it or not, that same song, "I'm Alive," is also going to be in usage for Kaiju Force Neo Ecstatic Times Season 3. Yeah, it takes place 10 years after Stuart Little 2's release. More specifically, Season 3, Episode 4. The same credit style that's used, with the names and faces of the characters in mind, are all in use. So of course, while I do copy the exact credit style that's in play with Ecstatic Times, that's basically a good notion that there is a lot of inspiration and even a lot of creative value that I get out of these movies that have really, really stuck with me for all these years. And what I have to say about Stuart Little 2, my overall final verdict of it, this is actually even better than the first film. It not only manages to give us a nice level of world building and also have some introductions of new cast members with James Woods as well as Melanie Griffith, whom plays Margalo, by the way. It really is a good way to add on more to a story that had been foretold in books, but in this instance, this is something that had been expanded upon without the need for the novel itself. But above all that, going from cats to a falcon sure was an impressive level, considering that some birds were actually even more powerful than your best of house and alley cats. So it just seems that the magnitude of things regarding the main antagonist is even greater in this film compared to the first. Not only that, James Woods, like I've mentioned earlier, has gotten a lot of notoriety in our lives, mostly because not just with Stuart Little 2, but also because of his pretty horrible intentions, even illegal intentions, in Family Guy and otherwise. I guess you could say he's one of those actors that is pretty notorious over the years. And it's not just from his success in the past, but even today, some confirmation has taken place that he unfortunately isn't really a great person. So, it's a sad truth that unfortunately we're going to have to learn to live with. But I will always remember this film with greatness and fondness in mind. And as a result of that, this film is going to get a good solid 9.1 out of 10.1. So, quite an improvement over the first film. It does give us more to work with, but believe it or not, we're not done yet. Tomorrow I will come back with the third and final film in the series, which goes from live action to animation. And it's mostly having to do with the likes of Jonathan Lipnicki growing up within just 3 years of time. So in any case, I'll be back tomorrow with Stuart Little 3, Call of the Wild. And you guys are going to hear every last minute of what I'd have to say about the Stuart Little films.
Whatever I want, I usually get. And I'm thinking I want you, but I don't have you yet. I ain't got no tricks to be playing on you.